Imagine running from your darkest secrets, only to realize you can never escape the truth. What happens when the past comes back to claim you? Stay with me as we unravel a chilling tale of murder, guilt, and the terrifying consequences of burying the truth. By the end of this story, you'll wish you had never heard it, but you won't be able to look away. Watch until the end, because this is a story that haunts long after the last word is spoken. The rain tapped against the window like impatient fingers. The room was dim, lit only by a flickering bulb swaying from the ceiling. A faint smell of damp wood and mildew hung in the air. It crept into her nostrils, sharp and unwelcome. Anna tightened her grip on the flashlight, her breath shallow. The beam of light trembled as she stepped forward. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight. A distant thud echoed through the house, startling her. She froze, heart hammering against her ribs. "Just the wind," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing taller. Her footsteps grew hesitant, each one louder than the last. The air felt heavier now, like a presence pressing against her chest. She reached the staircase, its banister chipped and splintered. Looking up, the second floor disappeared into darkness. She hesitated, the silence deafening. Then came the sound, a dragging noise, slow and deliberate, from above. Her pulse quickened, her hand shaking as she aimed the light upward. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. The dragging stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, cold against her skin. Summoning courage, she placed a foot on the first step. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the empty house. Another step, then another. Each one brought her closer to the unknown. The smell of iron grew stronger, metallic and sharp. She covered her nose, gagging, but pressed on. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness. The beam of her flashlight revealed peeling wallpaper and closed doors. One stood slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. The dragging sound resumed, louder now, just beyond that door. Her hand hovered over the knob, fingers trembling. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. Inside, the light swung wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room was bare, except for a large wooden trunk in the center. The lid was slightly open, something dark spilling over the edge. Anna stepped closer, her heart pounding louder than the storm outside. Her flashlight flickered, then went out. Darkness swallowed her, and the dragging noise stopped, right behind her. Anna's breath caught in her throat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned, her flashlight still dead in her hand. Behind her, the faint outline of a figure loomed in the shadows. It wasn't moving. Not yet. The rain outside battered the windows harder, as if urging her to run. Anna's fingers fumbled over the flashlight, slapping it, twisting the base. A spark of light flickered and illuminated the space for just a second. What she saw made her legs turn weak. A face, pale and featureless, hovered inches from hers. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, splitting its face in half. A sound like grinding teeth filled the air. She screamed, stumbling backward, crashing into the wooden trunk. The lid flew open with a thud. The stench of decay hit her full force, and bile rose in her throat. Inside the trunk were bones, yellowed and brittle. Pieces of torn fabric clung to them, darkened with dried blood. She pushed herself away from it, her hands slipping on the slick floor. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Anna scrambled to her feet, her flashlight clattering to the ground. "Stay back," she yelled, though her voice cracked with terror. The figure paused, tilting its head, as if curious. Then it lunged. Anna ducked instinctively, feeling the rush of air as it swiped at her. She bolted for the door, her feet pounding against the floor. Behind her, the figure's dragging footsteps followed, faster now. Her chest burned as she ran, the hallways stretching endlessly before her. Every door she passed seemed to groan and rattle, as though begging to be opened. The staircase loomed ahead, her only escape. She took the steps two at a time, her hand gripping the banister. The figure was close, its ragged breathing almost in her ear. The front door was in sight, the rain-soaked world beyond it a beacon of safety. Anna reached for the knob, twisting it frantically. It wouldn't budge. Behind her, the breathing stopped. Her fingers trembled as she turned to face it. The figure stood at the base of the stairs, still as stone. Its hollow eyes stared up at her, unblinking. Anna pressed her back against the door, her mind racing for a way out. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed at her. From upstairs, the dragging sound began again. This time, there were two. Anna's chest heaved, her lungs struggling for air as her mind screamed for escape. The second dragging noise grew louder, heavier, echoing from the shadows above. Her fingers clawed at the door, nails scraping against the wood. The lock clicked, but it wouldn't turn. It was as if the house itself refused to let her go. "Let me out," she cried, her voice cracking. A low creak answered from the stairs. She turned her head, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out the storm outside. A second figure emerged at the top of the staircase. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it was pulled by invisible strings. Anna's knees buckled, her legs refusing to carry her. The flashlight lay on the floor, casting weak, erratic beams that danced over the walls. In the faint light, she saw the second figure's face. It was blank, featureless, yet somehow alive, its head twitching at impossible angles. The two figures moved in unison now, one ascending, the other descending. Trapping her. The air grew colder, a suffocating chill that made her breath visible. The house groaned, its walls seeming to pulse and shift around her. Anna backed away from the door, her body trembling. Her hands found the flashlight, and she gripped it tightly, her only weapon. "I won't die here," she screamed, raising it like a club. The figures stopped again, tilting their heads in eerie synchronicity. They seemed to study her, as if deciding something. The one from the stairs reached the bottom, its hand brushing against the trunk. The lid slammed shut, sending a sharp crack through the silence. The second figure descended slowly, dragging one leg behind it. Anna's instincts screamed to move, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Then, the first figure opened its mouth. From its gaping maw came a voice, a distorted, warped version of her own. "Anna," it hissed, drawing out her name like a curse. Her stomach churned as she realized it wasn't just imitating her voice. It was speaking her thoughts. "You don't belong here." The second figure joined in, its voice raspier, but equally haunting. "You brought this upon yourself." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head violently. I don't know what you mean." But deep down, she felt a flicker of recognition, buried beneath the terror. Something she had forgotten, or maybe chosen to forget. The figures stepped closer, their movements fluid now, almost human. Anna swung the flashlight wildly, the light sputtering against the encroaching dark. The door behind her rattled, then burst open, spilling rain and wind into the room. She turned to run, but a cold, clammy hand clamped around her wrist. It yanked her back with inhuman strength, spinning her around. The figures were inches away now, their breath icy against her skin. "You can't leave," they said in unison. "Not until you remember." Before she could scream, the light went out, plunging her into suffocating blackness. The darkness consumed her. Anna's breath came in sharp gasps, her chest tight, as if the air itself had thickened. She flailed blindly, her arms striking empty space. The cold hand that had gripped her wrist was gone. But she wasn't alone. The sound of whispers rose around her, low and unintelligible at first. They grew louder, overlapping, voices filled with anger, sorrow, and accusation. Her name echoed among them, distorted and fragmented. Anna, Anna. She covered her ears, but the voices seeped into her skull, vibrating through her bones. The floor beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting like wet sand. She stumbled, falling hard onto her hands and knees. The ground was cold and damp, the smell of rot and earth filling her nose. Her palms brushed against something sharp. She recoiled, but not before her fingers closed around it, a small object, solid and cold. She brought it closer, her trembling hands searching for clues in the dark. The whispers quieted, replaced by a single, deep voice. "You know what this is?" Anna's heart skipped as she recognized it, a key. Its jagged edges bit into her skin as she clutched it tightly. A faint light flickered ahead, barely visible through the dense darkness. It pulsed like a dying heartbeat, casting faint shadows over the space. Anna crawled toward it, her limbs heavy as if the air itself resisted her movements. The whispers resumed, sharper now, laced with venom. "Do you remember now? Do you see what you've done?" She reached the source of the light, a shattered mirror, its fragments glinting like trapped stars. Her reflection stared back, fractured and distorted. Her eyes widened as the pieces began to move, shifting and rearranging. The fragments formed a new image, a memory. Anna saw herself, younger, standing in the very same house. Her hands were red, dripping with blood. The memory hit her like a thunderclap. The trunk, the bones, the figures. She screamed as the realization washed over her, a tidal wave of guilt and horror. The whispers turned to laughter, cruel and mocking. The figures reappeared, their faces now unmistakably human. One was a man, his hollow eyes filled with pain. The other a woman, her face streaked with tears that never fell. "You locked us away," the man said, his voice trembling. "You thought you could bury the past," the woman added, her tone sharper. Anna shook her head, the key trembling in her grasp. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, but her words faltered. The truth stared back at her from the mirror, undeniable. The figures stepped closer, their forms becoming clearer, more real. "You can't escape this," they said in unison, their voices blending into a haunting symphony. The light grew brighter, blinding her as they reached out. Her screams were swallowed by the storm as the house itself seemed to shudder and collapse into silence. The blinding light faded, and Anna found herself lying on cold, damp ground. The storm had stopped. The silence pressed down on her, heavier than the noise had been. She opened her eyes cautiously, her vision blurred and stinging. The house was gone. In its place was an open field, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. The key was still in her hand, its edges digging into her palm. Her heart raced as she pushed herself up, scanning the empty landscape. The figures were nowhere to be seen, but their voices lingered, faint whispers carried on the breeze. "You can't bury the past. You can't escape what you've done." Anna staggered forward, her legs weak and unsteady. She felt an overwhelming pull, like an invisible thread guiding her. Her feet moved on their own, dragging her toward the center of the field. There, half buried in the earth, was the wooden trunk. Its surface was warped and rotting, but the shape was unmistakable. Her chest tightened as the memories rushed back, unbidden and cruel. The laughter, the fight, the sharp crack of bone, and the panic. Her hands, trembling and slick with blood, shoving the bodies into the trunk, nailing it shut, hiding it in the house. She dropped to her knees before the trunk, the key burning in her hand like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. Her tears fell freely now, mixing with the dirt beneath her. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, suffocating her. "Open it, Anna." Her hands trembled as she brought the key closer to the rusted lock. "I didn't mean to," she sobbed, but the trunk seemed to mock her with its silence. The key slid into the lock with a metallic scrape, fitting perfectly. Her heart pounded as she hesitated, her fingers hovering over the key. The air grew colder, the shadows around her stretching and writhing. "Open it," the voices demanded, their tone sharp and unyielding. With a final, shuddering breath, Anna turned the key. The lock clicked, the sound echoing in the stillness. The lid creaked open on its own, revealing the contents within. Bones, splintered and yellowed, shifted as if disturbed by an unseen force. But it wasn't just bones. At the very bottom, something moved. A hand, decayed and skeletal, yet alive, clawed its way out of the pile. Anna scrambled back, but the hand grabbed her ankle with impossible strength. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, the voices overlapping, screaming her name. The ground beneath her gave way, crumbling into a black void. She fell, her screams swallowed by the darkness, the trunk's lid slamming shut above her. And then there was nothing. Anna's body hit something hard and unyielding, the impact forcing the air from her lungs. The darkness persisted, but it wasn't empty. She felt the weight of the air, oppressive and suffocating, like being trapped underwater. The whispers had returned, but now they were clearer, sharper, cutting through her like blades. "Do you feel it, Anna?" The voice was no longer distant. It was everywhere, above her, beside her, inside her mind. She scrambled to her feet, her hands brushing against smooth, cold stone. The faint scent of earth and decay lingered, mingling with the coppery tang of blood. A faint light began to glow in the distance, a pale, sickly green. It illuminated her surroundings, revealing towering walls carved from black stone. Symbols were etched into the surface, their jagged lines pulsing faintly with the same green light. She reached out to touch one, and the stone was ice-cold beneath her fingertips. Her head throbbed as images flashed in her mind, unfamiliar faces twisted in pain, their mouths open in silent screams. "Anna," the voice called again, softer this time, almost coaxing. She turned toward the source of the light, her feet moving as if under someone else's control. The path was narrow, the walls pressing closer with each step. She could hear the faint sound of water dripping, each drop echoing like a gunshot. The key was still in her hand, its weight growing heavier with each passing second. Ahead, the path opened into a cavernous room. The light pooled in the center, casting shadows that danced like living things. In the middle of the room stood a figure, its back to her. It was tall and impossibly thin, its form barely human. Anna froze, every muscle in her body screaming for her to turn and run. But she couldn't. The figure turned slowly, its movements deliberate and unnerving. Its face was a void, an absence of features that made her stomach churn. And yet, she felt its gaze pierce through her, cold and unrelenting. "You remember now," it said, its voice a blend of countless others. Anna shook her head violently, tears streaking her face.
"No."
"I didn't mean to." The figure raised a hand, silencing her. "You can't undo what's been done," it said. The symbols on the walls flared, their light growing brighter until they bathed the room in a sickly glow. The cavern shuddered, the ground beneath her cracking and splitting open. From the fissures, hands emerged, dozens of them, clawed and skeletal. They reached for her, their bony fingers curling around her ankles, pulling her down. Anna screamed, fighting against their grip, but the more she struggled, the stronger they became. "You must face it," the figure said, its voice echoing in her mind. "Only then can you be free." The ground gave way entirely, and Anna fell again, the darkness swallowing her whole. This time, the void was not silent. The screams of the past roared around her, and deep within, she recognized her own. Anna's descent felt endless, a spiral into the abyss where time stretched and twisted. The air rushed past her, cold and biting, carrying with it fragments of voices, pleading, accusing, crying out her name. Anna. The whispers were louder now, closer, swirling around her like a storm. Her body jolted to a stop, landing on something soft and yielding. She opened her eyes, her breath ragged. Beneath her was earth, damp and freshly disturbed, the scent of soil thick in the air. She was in a forest. The sky above was a muted gray, the trees skeletal and bare, their branches clawing at the heavens. Anna pushed herself up, her limbs trembling. She realized she still clutched the key, its sharp edges digging into her palm. Before her stood the trunk. Not buried, not hidden, but sitting in plain sight, as if waiting for her. Her stomach churned, ball rising in her throat. She knew this place. She had been here before. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. It was the clearing where she had dragged the bodies, her hands shaking with every step. The clearing where she had buried them. And now they had returned. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint voices that sounded like laughter. Anna. Her name echoed, mocking and cruel. The trunk creaked, its lid slowly lifting, as if unseen hands were opening it. Anna froze, her breath caught in her chest. From within the trunk, a figure began to rise. It was the woman, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She stared at Anna, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You thought you could forget," the woman said, her voice hollow and cold. Behind her, the man emerged, his movements jerky and disjointed. His face was twisted in a grotesque semblance of a smile. "But we remember," he said, his voice a low growl. Anna stumbled back, shaking her head violently. No, please." The earth beneath her feet began to shift, cracking open to reveal more skeletal hands. They clawed their way out of the ground, dragging broken bodies behind them. The clearing filled with the dead, their empty eyes fixed on her. "You can't run," they chanted in unison, their voices blending into a chilling harmony. The man and woman stepped closer, their forms becoming more solid, more real. Anna fell to her knees, her body trembling as she clutched the key to her chest. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know what else to do." The woman knelt before her, her cold, lifeless hand reaching out to touch Anna's cheek. "You can't escape this, Anna," she said softly, her tone almost tender. "This is where it ends." The figures surrounded her now, their hands reaching for her, pulling her into the earth. The soil swallowed her screams, their weight dragging her deeper into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the trunk, its lid closing with a final, resounding thud. Darkness enveloped Anna completely, but she wasn't gone. She was somewhere else now, suspended in an endless void. The air was thick, heavy, and clung to her skin like damp cloth. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. But she could hear them. The voices were clearer than ever, sharp and cutting, like whispers pressed directly into her mind. "Do you see now? You've always been here." The void began to shift, the darkness swirling and folding in on itself. Shapes emerged, faint at first, then clearer with every passing moment. She was back in the house. Not as it was before, but as it had been, alive, vibrant, filled with light. She stood in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air. Laughter echoed from the other room, warm and inviting. Anna turned toward the sound, her body moving as if in a dream. The living room was filled with people. The woman and the man were there, smiling and alive, holding glasses of wine. They were surrounded by friends, their voices blending in a joyful symphony. Anna watched from the doorway, her chest tightening. This was before the fight, before the blood. Her own voice joined the others, light and carefree, as she stepped into the room. But it wasn't her. It was a version of her she barely recognized, radiant, unburdened. The memory played out like a film she couldn't stop. The mood shifted suddenly, the laughter fading, replaced by sharp, angry words. The man's face darkened, his voice rising. The woman shouted back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And then there was Anna, the real Anna, standing at the edge of the memory, watching it all unfold. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Please, no." But it continued, unstoppable. The shouting escalated. A glass shattered. And then came the sound, a sickening crack that echoed through the house. The man crumpled to the floor, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. The woman screamed, but it was short-lived. Anna watched as her own hands wrapped around the woman's neck, squeezing until the life drained from her body. The memory Anna stepped back, panting, her face a mask of horror. Her trembling hands dragged the bodies away, into the dark corners of the house. Anna screamed, falling to her knees, clutching her head as the memories bombarded her. "You did this," the voices whispered, their tone almost pitying now. "You made us." The scene dissolved, the house crumbling into ash. The void returned, but this time, Anna wasn't alone. The man and woman stood before her, their forms shimmering like fading reflections. "It's time," they said in unison. "For you to stay." Anna's body felt impossibly heavy, the weight of her guilt pulling her down. The earth rose around her, swallowing her feet, her legs, her chest. She didn't fight it. For the first time, she understood. She belonged here. And as the darkness claimed her once more, the whispers faded into silence. Anna sank into the earth, the weight of her guilt pressing down like an unyielding tide. The darkness cradled her now, not as a void, but as something alive. It pulsed and breathed, surrounding her with a strange, cold familiarity. She opened her eyes, if they were even hers anymore, and saw faint shapes forming in the murk. Memories. They weren't just hers. They were the man's, the woman's, the house's. They unfolded like pages from a book, each more vivid than the last. The couple had been happy once. The man's laughter echoed as he painted the walls, bright and full of promise. The woman's hands lovingly tended to the garden, the flowers vibrant and blooming. But cracks had begun to show. Arguments about money, secrets whispered behind closed doors. And then Anna had come into their lives. The scenes blurred, faster now, spiraling into chaos. Anna saw herself again, no longer the carefree guest, but the catalyst, the spark that ignited the fire. She had fed their suspicions, whispered provocations, turned their fears into rage. It hadn't been intentional, or had it? Her mind twisted, unable to reconcile the truth with the person she thought she was. The images slowed, sharpening to a single moment. The night, the fight, the bodies. Anna had cleaned up the mess, buried the evidence, and locked it all away in the trunk. Not just the bodies, but the memories, the guilt, the truth. And now, the trunk was gone. The weight was back where it belonged, pressing against her chest, filling her lungs with the cold, damp air of the earth. The figures appeared again, their forms clearer now. Not monsters, not ghosts, but the man and the woman as they once were. Whole. Real. They knelt beside her, their expressions soft but unrelenting. "It's over, Anna," the man said, his voice steady. "You can't keep running," the woman added, her tone firm but not unkind. Anna wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, tears streaming down her face. The darkness shifted, light breaking through in thin, golden beams. The ground beneath her softened, the cold giving way to warmth. She felt herself rising, her body lighter than it had been in years. The man and woman reached out, their hands brushing hers, and for a moment, she felt peace. But as the light grew brighter, their forms began to fade. "Goodbye, Anna," they said in unison, their voices a fading echo. And then they were gone. Anna stood alone in the clearing, the trunk nowhere in sight. The forest was alive again, the trees full and green, the air fresh and clean. She took a deep breath, the weight on her chest finally lifted. But the key was still in her hand. Its edges were smooth now, polished, and it gleamed faintly in the sunlight. She slipped it into her pocket, the metal cool against her skin. Anna turned and walked away, the whispers gone, the past buried where it belonged. For now. Anna walked deeper into the forest, her feet soft against the damp earth, the air thick with the scent of pine and decay. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shadows that danced and shifted like memories, fading and reappearing. She didn't look back. The past was behind her, locked away. But a strange feeling lingered, a weight on her chest that even the light couldn't lift. The key in her pocket burned faintly, a quiet reminder of what she had done. The world seemed peaceful now, but it wasn't real peace. It was a fragile illusion. Every step she took felt like it carried her further from what she had left behind. Yet, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. A shiver ran down her spine, her pulse quickening as the forest grew quieter around her. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the steady rhythm of her footsteps, growing louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. The silence deepened, pressing in from all sides. Anna stopped in her tracks, holding her breath. In the distance, she saw something, a figure, standing motionless between the trees. Her heart skipped a beat. It was just a shadow at first, an outline too faint to make out. But as she stared, the shape grew clearer. A man. Tall, dressed in tattered clothes. His face was obscured, hidden in shadow. She could feel him watching her, the weight of his gaze palpable, like fingers brushing across her skin. A chill ran through her, but she couldn't move. The figure took a slow step forward. Another. Each movement deliberate, calculated. The space between them closed, and with every step, Anna's heartbeat thundered louder in her ears. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He was close now, too close. And then, with a sudden, chilling clarity, she saw his eyes. Empty. Black holes, sucking in all light. They stared at her with a knowing intensity, unblinking. She could see her reflection in them. But it wasn't the woman she saw in the mirror anymore. It was the version of herself she had buried, the one that had killed, that had hidden the truth. And in his eyes, she saw the trunk, the bodies, the blood. Anna backed away slowly, her feet dragging, her mind screaming. But the figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching her, as the space between them grew smaller and smaller. "Do you think you've escaped?" his voice whispered, a low hiss that slithered through her skin. The words lingered, a curse in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Do you think you're free?" Anna turned and ran. The key pressed into her pocket, an anchor pulling her back with every step she took. Her breath was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest twisted around her, the trees closing in like walls. She ran faster, but the sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, closer. The figure was gaining, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. Her foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling forward into the earth. She gasped for breath, but before she could get up, the figure was there, looming above her. His shadow stretched over her, suffocating her in its cold embrace. "You'll never be free," he said softly. Anna's vision blurred, her world spinning. And then, everything went black. Anna's body felt weightless, as if floating in an endless sea of blackness. No sound, no movement, just the silence pressing in from all sides. She couldn't tell how much time had passed. It could have been minutes, hours, or days. She tried to open her eyes, but they were sealed shut, as if the darkness had taken hold of them. Her breath was shallow, quick, her chest rising and falling with each panicked inhale. Then, A faint flicker, a light. It wasn't bright, but it was enough to pull her toward it. She reached out with trembling fingers, the cool sensation of the earth beneath her fingertips grounding her. Her eyes cracked open slowly, her vision blurry, and she saw the figure. The same man. He was standing over her again, his presence suffocating, his empty eyes fixed on her with that same unnerving intensity. But this time, something had changed. His face was clearer now, and though his expression was void of emotion, Anna could feel the weight of his judgment pressing down on her. "You thought you could outrun it," he said, his voice like the sound of gravel scraping against stone. "You thought the past would stay buried." Anna tried to speak, but her mouth felt dry, as if her words were trapped in her throat. The key still burned in her pocket, its presence undeniable. The man crouched down, his face inches from hers. "You can never run from the truth, Anna. It's always with you." His eyes glowed now, like two black holes, pulling her deeper into their depths. She felt herself falling into them, her thoughts spinning, her past unraveling before her eyes. The house, the trunk, the blood. Her hands, shaking as they shoved bodies into the dark. The life she had taken, lost, buried, hidden. The man's voice echoed again, louder this time. "You can't hide from yourself." Her breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of the truth settled over her like a heavy blanket. The truth she had denied for so long. The truth that had been buried in the earth, in the trunk, in the deepest corners of her mind. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice cracking. The man's gaze softened, just for a moment, but it was enough to feel the faintest hint of pity. "You never did. But you did it anyway." The ground beneath her began to tremble, the earth shifting as if it were alive. The darkness, once all-encompassing, began to recede, revealing the clearing. The trees stood tall once more, their branches twisting and reaching toward the sky. The figure stood up, taking a step back. But Anna remained on the ground, her eyes wide, her breath still ragged. "You cannot escape," the man said, his voice now a distant whisper. The light around her grew brighter, but it wasn't comforting. It was blinding. She tried to shield her eyes, but the light consumed her, wrapping around her like chains. Her chest tightened, and she gasped for breath as her vision blurred once more. The last thing she saw before the light swallowed her entirely were the shadows of the trees, their branches reaching toward her, like hands beckoning her back into the darkness. And then there was nothing. The darkness that had consumed Anna suddenly shattered. It wasn't the gradual fade. It was as if something had ripped the veil of shadow apart, exposing her to a blinding white light. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't see. But the light was harsh, almost suffocating. It enveloped her, pushing her backward, forcing her to face the very truth she had run from. As the brightness dimmed, Anna found herself standing in the clearing once more, only it was no longer the same. The trees were no longer skeletal. They were alive, their leaves shimmering in a strange, golden glow. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, the ground soft beneath her feet. But something was off. The forest had changed, its beauty overshadowed by a sense of foreboding that lingered in the air like smoke. Anna's pulse quickened as she turned, her eyes scanning the scene. In the distance, she saw a figure. It was the man. But his features were different now, more human, more solid, but still cold. He was standing by the trunk, the one she had buried in her memories, waiting. Her heart skipped a beat. "No," she whispered, her body trembling. "You can't escape." His voice came from everywhere, a whisper that brushed against her skin, curling inside her mind. Anna stepped forward, her feet moving as if someone else was guiding them. The closer she got, the more the weight of the truth pressed down on her. The trunk wasn't just an object. It was the vessel of her guilt, her shame, her sins. She could feel it, could feel the lives she had destroyed buried within it. But the trunk wasn't alone. The figures, The man and the woman emerged from the shadows, their eyes hollow and lifeless. "You can't escape what you've done, Anna," the woman said, her voice soft but filled with accusation. The man stood still, his gaze never leaving her. "You're bound to us now. Forever." Anna wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Her breath quickened, her mind racing, and the light around her grew dim once again. She reached out to touch the trunk, her hand trembling. The moment her fingers made contact, the world exploded into a rush of images, flashes of blood, of pain, of regret. Her hands stained, the bodies lifeless, the cries haunting. Her knees buckled as she fell to the ground. And then she knew. This wasn't a punishment. It was a reckoning. The final end. The price she had to pay for what she had done. The clearing around her began to fade, the light collapsing into darkness once again. And as everything dissolved, Anna understood. She wasn't meant to escape. She was meant to remember. The darkness took its final grip, tightening around Anna, and she felt her body dissolve into the void. But there was no panic this time, no racing heart. Instead, a strange calm settled over her, as if she had become one with the endless nothing. The shadows wrapped around her like a blanket, gentle and cold. And she understood. It wasn't about escaping. It was about embracing what she had done, confronting the parts of herself she had buried so deep they became unrecognizable. The man and the woman were no longer there, their voices silenced, their figures reduced to memories. Only she remained. The forest, the trunk, the whispers, they were all parts of her now, woven into the very fabric of her being. As the last vestige of light flickered and vanished, Anna took a deep breath. Not one of fear or regret, but one of acceptance. The world she had left behind, the life she had destroyed, no longer held power over her. She had faced the darkness, faced herself, and there was no more running. The weight in her chest was gone, replaced by a strange stillness. She was at peace. The echoes of her past lingered, but they no longer controlled her. They were just memories now, fragments of a life that no longer mattered. In this place, there was only truth. And the truth was that she had paid the price. The forest slowly faded away, dissolving into the cold, empty space that had first embraced her. There was no more sound, no more light, no more life. Just the void, stretching out forever. And in the stillness, Anna finally understood the last lesson. Some things were never meant to be fixed, only accepted. And in the end, that acceptance was freedom. Her final breath left her body, and she drifted into the silence, no longer Anna of the past, but just a part of the darkness, free, whole, and unburdened.